Science is magic. There seems to be a consensus that it is easily one of the most powerful tools humankind has ever possessed. Throughout history, science has been used as a significantly powerful tool of invention and advancement of civilization. But what about the dark side of science? Have you ever wondered about how this exact tool has long been used to divide us by endorsing long-existing prejudiced belief systems? Today, let us dive into the dark side of this superpower to talk about scientific racism. Scientific racism is the flawed theory which uses biased scientific and pseudoscientific studies to promote the superiority of one race above all others, particularly white above all others. This detrimental notion is based largely on the belief that innately different levels of physical, intellectual, and moral development of racial and ethnic groups exist that distinguish them as superior and inferior. Throughout history, colonial rulers have advocated for the misuse of information by scientists to prove the superiority of the white man above all other races to promote and justify colonialism, slavery, theft, and other kinds of oppression. By misusing scientific data of all sorts, including anatomical, geographic, cultural, and even intelligence, the prejudiced scientists of the white Western world have long endorsed colonialist globetrotting, leading to direct promotion of the colonial rulers as worthier authority figures and supervisors of a culture they did not understand and could not bear. Around 400 years ago, when the first human slaves were brought to the United States, there were different ways to justify this abhorrent practice. This included manipulation of the morality of the general public with biased views and scientific ways to back the oppressive, racist way of life. In the 19th and 20th centuries, famous scientists of esteemed ranks took an active part in socially detrimental practices by introducing data collected through flawed pseudoscientific methods. One very interesting example is the now discredited concept of polygenism, which postulated that human races were distinct species with different origins. This fundamental distinction led scientists to believe that races were not only different physically, but also in intelligence, morality, emotions, and other human characteristics, because of the way their evolutions came into being. This idea fueled the belief in racial hierarchies and discrimination, putting white people on top. Later, racism gained popularity in human studies like social sciences. Scientists put their beliefs into their research by manipulating data and displaying it in ways that fed into the anti-black, pro-white notion. Biased data collection from oppressive institutions that worked overtime to demonize and imprison the common black man described high criminality statistics among the African American population, leading to further systemic oppression and criminalization of the black way of life. Scientific notions like this have only caused harm to the general advancement of humankind, and rarely any good. Many individuals, politicians, and political parties, intellectuals, and other esteemed placeholders took center stage with their involvement. Scientists like Samuel George Morton, Louis Agassiz, and Paul Broca were directly involved in the curation and justification of the concept of polygyny. Individually, they worked towards explaining different factors of the theory of polygyny, determining how Europeans were intellectually superior based on their head sizes. Louis Agassiz was a firm believer of the idea that different races have different origins and have evolved differently. Another factor was that varying skull sizes made for different intellect levels, with Europeans having bigger skulls and thus more intellect. Combined, their work fed into the concept of genetic superiority of the white race above all others. Francis Galton was at the forefront of the eugenics movement, and not only believed in, but also worked to promote the practice of sterilization of the women of other races to prevent progression of their race. The believers of intellectual movements like social Darwinism and eugenics gathered their own audience and contributors. Social Darwinism applied the theory of natural selection and implied the success and survival of the fittest societies, which to them meant civil intellectuals as compared to their savage, indigenous counterparts. Eugenics again endorsed the former movement, meaning the survival and degree of advancement of a society should not be left to nature, as that would take centuries. Instead, the prediction for the future was crystal clear when an intellectually, physically, and morally superior species already exists. On an even wider scale, governments and politicians believed in the cause wholeheartedly and used their powers to promote the racial discrimination. The government of the United States, Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, to name a few, were front and center for the promotion of this belief system. Government-backed slavery, theft, and systemic oppression in the United States, an extreme practical application of systemic racism by Hitler-led Nazis in the Holocaust, and the horrific racial laws implemented by Mussolini all contributed heavily to the cause. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the ideology of scientific racism was so widespread it had taken over most of the world. In Europe, the United Kingdom was the birthplace of cultural movements like social Darwinism and eugenics, and the biggest global colonial rule. Germany was another center for the practice of the belief of scientific racism, particularly during the Nazi era. France, too, as it regularly enforced colonial rule with its oppressive laws in Africa and Asia, determining the colonized as inferior and the colonizers as superior. In North America, the United States of America has widely been considered the hub of racism, but especially scientific racism. With their dark history of slavery, segregation, and practices of eugenics, the USA stands at #1 in competition of systemic racism. Canada, being a neighbor, adopted the same policies against indigenous and non-European immigrants, fueling the system of oppression rather than not participating at all. The colonized territories included Africa, Asia, Australia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, each with their unique and shared experiences with colonization for a great number of years. In South Africa alone, scientific racism was responsible for the apartheid regime, where the horrible pseudoscience-backed segregation and racism prevailed for several years. Despite its basis of origin being mostly moral bias, scientific racism was surprisingly resilient and prevailed for centuries. Of course, it had its downfall after generational struggles and civil uproars, but it wasn't as quick and effective as our oppressed ancestors would have hoped for. What started as one racial group's belief took centuries of work by indigenous populations and all races around the world to undo, driven by a combination of scientific advancements, social movements, moral challenges of racist ideologies, and generations of anti-racist activism. The demise of scientific racism finally unfolded. Scientific advancements like the discovery of DNA and the Human Genome Project, along with evolutionary studies, collectively discredited the theory of polygenism. The discovery of DNA introduced the concept of monogeny, which expressed the importance of the similarity of races and the shared point of origin, if any. Although fully completed in 2003, the Human Genome Project is a longitudinal study demonstrating genetic similarity, proving that race is not a scientifically valid concept, only a social construct. Social movements that arose after the horrific practical display of scientific racism in the Holocaust, along with the civil uprising movement in the United States and the global anti-colonial movements across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, all led to the downfall of this long-standing ideology. Moral challenges to these racist beliefs came into question when the Nazis pushed to the extreme with the Holocaust. Additionally, creating authoritative bodies like the United Nations responsible for ethically challenging nations worldwide to keep them in check also helped bring about peace and global social comfort. Additionally, a shift in academic paradigms with corrected, unbiased research and evidence helped undo the damage as it discredited many preconceived beliefs. With time, as improvements in the education system occurred, so did the knowledge and public awareness. This further led to the social unacceptance of social racism. Although a very dark chapter in the history of modern mankind, the fall of scientific racism also serves as a triumph for human rights and equality. Historical events like these have taught us to regulate the spread of knowledge and introduced a concept of ethical approval in all scientific data collection and their release to the general public. It is also a reminder for us to learn from our past and go above and beyond to prevent its recurrence, for a prosperous and socially secure future.